the courtroom. Dr. Metzner, I remind you that you're still under oath.
Yes.
Mr. Brockler, you may proceed with your cross-examination of Dr. Metzner.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Dr. Messner.
Good morning.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounded like a lot of what you just testified to here before you couched in terms of, hey, I've testified to this before. Did it feel that way to you?
Yes.
What I want to do is explore some of the things that you talked about with Miss Brady regarding the mental illness and the role that it may have played in this particular case, okay?
Yes.
You would agree with me that amongst the various mental health professionals that saw the defendant, there isn't unanimity about exactly what it is he's diagnosed with. You'd agree with that?
Yes.
Now, there is some consensus about sort of the spectrum with which he may apply, may fall into. Is that fair?
Yes.
Now, one of the things that I heard you say with Miss Brady, and again, I think you testified to this previously, is that the name of the diagnosis is not as important as its impact. In fact, it's not important at all. It's the impact on the person's function. Fair?
Yes.
In fact, someone could be called schizophrenic, schizophreniform, schizoaffective, any of those things. And even within that diagnosis, there's a broad range of how much it impairs that person. Is that fair?
Yes.
So what I want to talk to you about is how this particular diagnosed or diagnosable mental illness impacted the defendant at the time leading up to and including July the 20th, 2012. Okay?
Yes.
One of the things that you have told us is that a good chunk of the conclusion that he has a serious mental illness, whatever it may be, is because he has a psychosis. Is that fair?
Yes.
And that psychosis exists because, what you've told us is, because he has a delusion. Fair?
Yes.
And that delusion is that he believes that when he kills a person, when he murders a person, it improves how he views himself, his own self-worth. Is that fair?
Yes.
And the crux of what you have testified to here today, and we'll get into more of the details in a bit, is that but for him believing that, but for him concluding, believing from whatever source that he could improve his self-value by killing people, he would not have killed people. Is that fair?
Yes.
So what I want to talk to you about then are some of the things that this is not, and then talk to you about some of the things that you mentioned regarding awareness and abilities, okay? First off, to be clear, this was not a command hallucination, correct?
Correct.
This wasn't the voice of God telling him to do it, correct?
Yes.
This wasn't some delusion or act predicated on doing something noble.
Correct.
In fact, and that's, just to be clear, you've seen the report from Dr. Gurr.
Yes.
You did not get from this defendant any suggestion that he thought he was doing people a favor by murdering them in that theater back on July 20th.
Correct.
And that he was not avoiding some impending catastrophe or the world coming to an end. Nothing like that, right?
Correct.
And by the way, there are delusions like that, aren't there?
Yes.
People that say, hey, if I don't commit this heinous act, California is going to break off and slip into the ocean. Fair?
Yes.
There are delusions where people commit heinous acts against someone believing that that's not a person, believing that it's a demon or an alien or some other thing, correct?
Yes.
And that's not this guy, right?
Correct.
So in fact, when he
Judge,
goes into...
I'm going to object to my approach, please.
Yes.
Doctor, I think where we left off was the delusion that you described to us before is not the ones that we just talked about, where someone misapprehends who or what they're killing, or that it was some other noble or beneficial purpose to other people, correct?
Yes.
Along those lines, I want to talk to you about, well, we'll get into the awareness. I want to talk to you about what he was aware of, because you'd mentioned that as part of your direct testimony. But before that, can we go back and say whenabouts we think this psychosis, as you've defined it, this belief that he would improve his self-worth, came to light? It sounds like that you're saying we can't know for sure, but the first manifestation of it that you see is that conversation that he has with his, even then, kind of ex-girlfriend in the Gmail chat of March 25th. Is that fair?
Yes.
Now, you'd agree with me that prior to that, if that's when the definite onset of this belief happens, he had had a long-standing hatred of mankind before that. You'd agree with that?
Yes.
And that he had had thoughts of and things that he described as obsessions to kill predating that, correct?
Yes.
In fact, some of that we know from things that he's told us, but most of it we know from something you described as a critical piece of evidence, and that is the notebook that he generated.
Correct.
And you'd agree with me that that notebook was generated prior to the crime, of course,
Yes.
and in anticipation of it being read by someone other than his parents, correct?
Yes.
He was writing it for another party, fair?
Yes.
You talked about him having an impaired awareness of reality. Am I using those words correctly?
Yes.
Let's talk about what he was able to appreciate and was aware of as he's walking into the theater on July 20th, 2012. What we know is, prior to that, he believed that his thoughts were evil. Is that fair?
Yes.
Judge, I'm going to object. The phrase evil and what that means in this context.
Mr. Bruckler, are you referring to a specific source?
Him, Your Honor, in the G chat from March 25th.
Okay, the objection is overruled.
And you understood that that was my question. He had actually referred to his thoughts about what he wanted to do as evil, correct?
Yes.
And that he was also aware that there wasn't anybody else that was going to agree with him about his desires.
Judge, can we approach, please?
Yes. Members of the jury, I need to give you a limiting instruction the testimony of Dr. Metzner in phase 2 of the sentencing hearing, which is the phase we're in right now, has been admitted only for the limited purpose of proving the existence or absence of any mitigating factor. You shall not consider this evidence for any other purpose. Does everyone understand that? Everyone's saying yes and nodding their head yes. Okay, thank you. Mr. Brockler, you may proceed. The objection is overruled otherwise.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sorry, forgive me. I think the last question I had asked you, Doctor, was about the fact that based on your review of the records and your discussions with him and even interviews with others, it is clear to you that at the time that he committed this, he did not believe that anybody else saw what he was doing as right, good, or correct. Fair?
Yes.
In fact, it was because of this awareness, in part, that other people would view what he was doing as wrong or evil or illegal, that he was able to make the decision to mislead them. Is that fair?
Yes.
In fact, some of the misleading took place with Doctors Fenton and Feinstein. You'd agree with that?
Yes.
In fact, he refuses to acknowledge to them the very specific and voluminous steps that he had taken to already put in plans this particular mass murder, correct?
Yes.
He does not reveal to them the details of the thoughts that he had even shown Miss Dada in the March 25th G-chat. Fair?
Yes.
And he does that because he doesn't want them to stop him, correct?
Correct.
He does not want to be locked up, correct?
Yes.
He also, as you know from reviewing the emails, he has an awareness that others would view this as wrong because he misleads his own parents, correct?
Yes.
He does not tell them what he is doing, fair?
Correct.
In fact, to the opposite, at every opportunity, tells them how nothing's going on in Denver, correct?
Yes.
And that, in fact, even I think as late as July the 12th, and I'm not pinning you to that, I'm saying I think it's July 12th, there's an email exchange with his father who wants to come out and visit him on the weekend of August the 10th to 12th, and even on July the 12th, he has such an awareness of what he's going to do and how it's perceived that he tells his father only, I have no plans that weekend. Fair?
Judge, I would object to speculation as to why he didn't tell his father.
Overruled?
Go ahead, sir.
Correct.
He also has an awareness that what he is thinking of doing, even at the time that he does these G-chats with Miss Dada, he has an awareness that what he's doing will likely lead to his own incarceration. Fair?
Yes.
And one of the things he's able to do, despite this described psychosis, is that he's able to weigh cause and effect and make decisions about how he values certain things. Is that fair?
Yes.
And we know that because in the G-chat of March 25th, one of the things that he values with her in that conversation is what it would be worth to be incarcerated and, quote, lose the rest of his life. Do you recall that?
Yes.
In fact, she says, hey, most people aren't worth the effort to kill them and you'll get locked up. Do you recall that exchange?
Yes.
And I'm not giving you an exact quote. If it's different, you can feel free to correct me. And he says, that's why you kill a lot of people, so that, in essence, you get that prison time at worst, but you've been able to kill a bunch. Did you get that from the G-chat?
Objection that states the evidence.
Overruled?
Go ahead, Doctor.
I think that's essentially what was said.
He also has an awareness enough, even in July, to have this exchange that you described with Miss Brady, a text exchange with Miss Allen. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And it's not just that he tells her, hey, I think something about the floodgates being open, which he testified to. But you recall that he's also able to mislead her about his future plans. Do you recall that?
I think that he said something to the effect that I'm handling things. He mentioned the dysphoric mania, how you doing, and basically said I'm handling things.
That's part of it. Do you recall an exchange where she texts him and asks, are you back in California? And he replies, no, I've got, in essence, more time on my lease and I'm going to see that through to the end. Words to that effect. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And we know at the time that he sends that, he's not going to see that at least through to the end, right?
Objection, speculation.
Doctor, you can't speculate, but you can answer the question if it's something that you spoke to him about or you have specific knowledge about. You can't speculate.
I think that's accurate.
Thank you. Let's talk about some other things that he was aware of in terms of reality as he was going to go into the theater those early morning hours. He was aware that he was going to kill human beings, correct?
Yes.
He was aware that there was a risk that amongst those human beings he was going to kill would be children, right?
Objection, speculation.
Again, doctor, you can't speculate. If it's something he said to you, or if you have any other basis for answering the question, you can answer it, but you can't speculate.
Judge, may we approach also?
Yes. Members of the jury, I remind you that the testimony of Dr. Metzner has been admitted in phase 2 of the sentencing hearing only for the limited purpose of proving the existence or absence of any mitigating factor. You shall not consider this evidence for any other purpose. And specifically, you shall not consider this evidence, this testimony, as evidence of aggravating factors. And furthermore, I instruct you that you are limited to the aggravating factors that you found the prosecution proved beyond a reasonable doubt in phase 1 of the sentencing hearing with respect to each count. Does everyone understand that? Everyone's saying yes. Okay. All right. With that understanding and with those instructions, Mr. Brockler, you may proceed with your questions. The objection is overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, based on your interviews and the other reports, the other background stuff that you've read, in fact, and I should ask you this, did you also, in terms of your opinion today, even include some of the subsequently revealed statements that were made to Doctors Reed and other folks in their opinions?
Yes.
Now, you're aware then, and I say you're aware that he had the awareness at the time that he goes into the theater that there was a risk that there would be children in that theater, correct?
I'm aware of that from Dr. Reed's evaluation. From my evaluation, I didn't specifically ask him that question.
And thank you for that. You're also aware, though, from your own report, too, that this was a matter that he also considered important enough to ask about immediately after the shooting to Detectives Apple and Mel.
Correct.
Same objection, Your Honor.
Same ruling.
In addition to being aware that he was going to kill people, you agree that the other thing he had an awareness of is that those people would not want to be killed.
Yes.
In fact, he had planned, in a quite detailed fashion, for them to try to resist his attempts to kill them. Fair?
I think it's fair because I think it was part of the selection of the particular theater goes into that. So yes.
Right, and that's not just the statements he made to you, but the notebook, correct?
Correct.
I mean, for instance, he anticipates and is aware that these people may try to flee, correct?
Yes.
And so he even gives thought to finding handcuffs to lock doors to keep those people from saving their own lives. Fair?
Yes.
And in fact, he brought handcuffs with him. Do you remember that?
Yes.
He's also aware that if, based on the documents and the evidence, he is aware that if he were to just get up and leave out of the theater without some innocuous explanation, people might be drawn to see what he's doing. Do you agree with that? And I'm specifically referring to his ruse with the cell phone call.
Yes.
He was also aware that if anybody saw him inside his car doing what he was about to do, they would try to stop him or maybe alert the authorities.
Yes.
And so that awareness led him to be able to take steps to obscure what he was doing in that car, right?
Correct.
He was also aware that these people that did not want to die may try to leave the theater.
Yes.
And beyond the handcuffs for the doors, he also brought with him tear gas.
Yes.
And the tear gas was intended to control that crowd.
Correct.
He also anticipated that they would suffer. Do you agree with that?
Objection. Misstates the evidence.
Overruled.
Go ahead.
Speculation.
Doctor, you can't speculate. Same ruling and instruction I've given you before. You cannot speculate. You're not about to speculate, not allowed to speculate or guess. But if you can answer the question based on specific information that the defendant provided to you or other information that you've reviewed in the record that's not speculation, then you can answer the question. And members of the jury, in terms of the objection as to misstatement of the evidence, I remind you that it is up to you to determine the state of the evidence. The lawyers can refer to the evidence, but you're not bound by what the lawyers say in terms of what the evidence is. You are to rely on your recollection. You determine what the evidence is, and you're to rely on your memory of the evidence for that. Does everyone understand that? And everyone's saying yes and not in their head yes. All right, Mr. Brockler, ask your question again, please.
Doctor, you'd agree based on the evidence and the statements that the defendant was aware that he would be causing these people to suffer?
I think he certainly had the capacity to have that awareness, and I think he also took steps to minimize that awareness, but yes.
Let's talk about the steps he took to minimize his ability to perceive and appreciate the suffering that he was going to inflict. You agree that he tried to darken parts of his gas mask?
Correct.
And do you interpret that, based on your review of the records and interview, that that was in part a way for him to minimize visibly what he was seeing that he was doing?
Objection, speculation.
Overruled?
Go ahead.
I didn't specifically talk with him about why he darkened it, so that I don't know.
You don't disagree that that could certainly be part of the motivation?
Objection, speculation.
Sustained.
How about the statements about putting in the headphones and cranking up the techno music to drown out any other sound?
Speculation.
Well, I'm not sure what the question is asking. Why don't you rephrase the question? The question started out with how about, but I don't know what it's referring to. So.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. What I mean by that is that, too, is an attempt to minimize his exposure to what he is doing in that theater. You'd agree?
Same objection.
Same ruling. You can't speculate, doctor. If it's an opinion that you can provide based on your expertise and your review of the record, you can provide it, but you can't speculate. Or you could answer it if it's something that that you spoke to the defendant about, or you have some other specific basis that allows you to answer the question.
I did talk with him about that, and I would agree. I think that was an attempt to make it more impersonal, and the more impersonal you make it, the less awareness you're going to have of suffering.
And so he's attempting to minimize his awareness and appreciation of what he's going to do. Fair?
Yes.
A couple things I should have asked you before, but my notes are everywhere. Forgive me. You would agree that this discussed belief that he could improve how he values himself took place after Miss Dada told him she saw no future with him. You'd agree with that?
Objection, misstates the evidence.
Overruled.
Go ahead, sir.
No, I'm just thinking of your
Oh,
question.
yeah. Go ahead.
Would you just ask me that again, please?
I'll break it up into little pieces. I don't want to mislead you here. So we've agreed that the first time that we see evidence of this belief that he is going to improve his self-worth is March 25th, 2012 in his G-chats with Miss Dada. Agreed?
Yes.
You would agree that March 25th, 2012 is after Miss Dada had initially broken up with him, telling him, I don't see a future with you.
Objection, misstates the evidence.
Overruled.
Go ahead, sir.
That's my understanding.
And it's after Professor Delacqua had told him, don't bother applying to be in my rotation because you're not a good fit.
I think that's accurate, too.
You also would agree that he never says to Drs. Fenton, Feinstein, or Roth that he's depressed.
Correct.
And they never make any observations of him being depressed.
That's correct.
His awareness of his situation and reality was such, you'd agree, that he could even try to plan to avoid the consequences of his conduct by thinking about escape.
Yes.
And some of that shows up in the purchases of the spikes, the road stars that were in the front of his car when he went in to do this thing, right?
Yes.
Some of that is in where he parked, directly behind the exit from where he was going to do this thing. You'd agree with that?
Yes.
Some of that is from, in fact, from the great diversion he had planned to take place with the explosion or fire at his apartment complex?
In relationship to escape?
To diverting away people from the theater, law enforcement, first responders, firefighters?
Yeah, well, I just be a little, disagree a bit. The diversion, as I understood it from him, was not for escape purposes. It was for delayed police response so he could kill more people.
Did you have a conversation with him like Dr. Reed did about what he was thinking when he stepped out of the back of theater number 9?
Yes.
And did he tell you what he told Dr. Reed, that he looked around, saw that the police had already gotten there, he'd done an assessment, realized he couldn't get away, and decided to give up?
Yes.
Is it speculation in your mind that if those police officers hadn't been there, he might have, as he told Dr. Reed, tried to get away?
Objection, speculation.
Sustained.
Doctor, did you have that conversation with him? What if the police hadn't been there? What if the diversion had worked? What would you have done?
Well, again, let me tell you my understanding of the
Yes, sir.
diversion. My understanding of the diversion was not to enhance his chances for escape. My understanding of the diversion was it would delay the arrival of the police so he would have more time to kill people. That it was, my understanding, it was unrelated to escape.
You'd agree that it could serve a dual purpose?
Objection, speculation.
Sustained.
Doctor, given the purchase of the Road Stars and the fact that they were moved to the front of the car and the other things, you don't have any information that that couldn't have been part of his thought process?
Objection, speculation.
He's asking if he has any other information about it, so.
You don't have anything, Doctor?
I don't.
I'm judging. I'm
Objections
sorry.
overruled.
I apologize, Your Honor.
That's okay.
I don't have any other information in what I've said about the diversion.
There was something else that triggered this question, but you had mentioned, hey, I didn't talk to him about certain things. Is it fair to say that you did not explore with him in detail the hatred that predated the belief that he would improve his self-worth by killing more people?
Well, we then get into the issue of what's more detail. I attempt to explore with him the hatred of mankind, and the particular example that I remember is the hatred of mankind is referenced in his notebook. And I asked him questions about his hatred of mankind and how long he's had it, and I got a fair amount of I don't know answers, and trying to ask the question different ways, different times. I didn't get much more information.
Well, thank you. Since you brought up the hatred in the notebook, you would agree with me that within the notebook, the first 3 pages, the ones after he writes, what's the meaning of life, what's the meaning of death, those first 3 pages are the ones that encompass what we're concluding are his thoughts about human capital. Agreed?
Yes.
And you'd agree within the confines of that, there's really more of a point system that seems to be set up in those first 3 pages. Agreed?
Yes.
And that point system is something that's repeated to Dr. Reed. You'd agree?
It's made more explicit to Dr. Reed, yes.
But with you, he doesn't describe it as a point system, does he?
I didn't get the description of a point system like Dr. Reed did.
Well, and it's more than that, isn't it, Doctor? Because what he did tell you was he thought that the value that he would accrue was dependent on variables such as how old or young someone was, correct?
That's correct.
Or whether or not they were a janitor or a doctor. Are those the 2 examples that he gave?
Doctor or surgeon, correct.
Doctor or surgeon, thank you. But those are things that he did not put down in his notebook, fair?
Yes.
And he did not tell Dr. Reed that, fair?
I think that's fair. I'm not sure it's fair to say, I'm not sure that whether Dr. Reed asked the same question that I got that elicited that information.
Well, and then let's be clear. You'd agree that what is in the notebook and what was told to Dr. Reed was more akin to la-di-da-di, everybody is worth 1, and that's how he came up with the conclusion that he's now worth 13.
Objection to the form of the question and personal opinion by the prosecutor.
Rephrase your question, Mr. Bruckler.
You'd agree that the notebook and what he told Dr. Reed is more akin to he gets a point per life, regardless of age or occupation or any of those things, that each person is worth 1.
I'd agree with that.
The hatred piece, let's talk about that. His statements about hatred to you and Dr. Reed, you'd agree, and I don't want this to sound nonsensical, but they take place after this crime has been committed, he's been arrested, and he's been accused of these heinous crimes. Fair?
Yes.
And after he's facing the prospect of a death sentence. Fair?
Yes.
The notebook was written before those things become a reality. Is that fair?
Yes.
And you'd agree that but for those 3 pages at the front end that describe a more point system type of, increase in value, that the rest of the notebook doesn't discuss or describe that at all. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
In fact, wouldn't you agree that the rest of the notebook includes multiple references to hatred and hatred of mankind?
I'd object that misstates the evidence.
Overruled.
I'm thinking about that. When I think of the notebook, that's not how I characterize the notebook. That's not to say there's not other references to hatred of mankind, but I don't view the notebook as the central theme of the notebook being hatred of mankind.
You'd agree that, and again, maybe I should ask, do you know how many times he uses the phrases hate, hatred, hatred of mankind, or some variation of that in the notebook?
I haven't counted them up, so no.
You'd agree that in through the planning of the numerous theaters that he went and sat in, and his description of the pros and the cons, all the way through his description of why he's doing what he's doing, there is no reference to human capital. You'd agree with that?
Yes.
And there is no reference to him doing what he's doing in those pages, to him increasing his value. Fair?
Yes.
In fact, what he's talking about is, these may not be the exact words, forgive me, but things like hatred unleashed or words to that effect. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And when he talks about his fear of consequences and his potential loss of that, you remember Miss Brady talking to you about that?
Yes.
I want to be clear. Were you aware from your conversations that he had discontinued sertraline in May?
I know when on direct I had said I wasn't sure when that was, and I believe I subsequently was listening to testimony by other experts, and that came out. So I am aware now, and I believe that at the time I interviewed him, I would have been aware at that time when that medication was discontinued.
And I think it's because it came up with Dr. Woodcock is where I think that first came out on the stand. Do you recall that?
I believe so.
Okay. So, just for purposes of finishing off that questioning, you'd agree with me that whatever statements he made to you after the fact about losing the fear, in no way was it an expression to you of losing the appreciation, awareness, or knowledge of the wrongfulness of what he was doing.
Correct. I've made it clear that I think that he had the capacity to know the difference between right from wrong with respect to those acts.
And also, in light of some of the questions that Ms. Brady asked, you also believe that he not only had the capacity, but the ability to make decisions.
Correct.
And to make choices about what to do.
Correct.
And all of these things that he was aware of that we've just gone through are things that he was able to consider in making his choices?
Yeah, so one thing I want to
Yes, sir.
say,
Go ahead.
Clearly he had the ability to make choices. I'm also clearly saying that I think the judgment he used in making those choices were impaired, and I think the judgment was impaired related to his delusional thinking.
That he would improve the way he valued himself based on how many people he killed.
Correct.
One of the other things that you had talked to us about is that you did not think, based on your discussions with him, the review of the other evidence, that hatred was a significant motivator for him. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Despite what's in the notebook.
Correct.
Also, you'd agree that whatever he said after he was arrested and charged with 165 counts and facing the death penalty about being remembered, you know that he took steps before July 20th, 2012 to be remembered for what he was going to do. Do you agree with that?
Objection to the form of the question.
Overruled?
Go ahead, Doctor.
Judge, I just want to make sure we're talking about before he was charged, correct?
That's how I understood it.
Okay, thank you.
Is that how you understood it, Doctor?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm assuming the answer is yes, and what I'm referring to is the selfies that he took.
Well, and in addition to that, you, and I don't know if you asked him this or if this came up with Dr. Reed, but do you recall at some point a conversation about him not wanting Hillary Allen to get drug into the media frenzy of being the girlfriend of a murderer? Was that you or was that Dr. Reed?
That was actually me.
That was you?
Yes.
So he was definitely aware of the reality that what he was going to do was going to be viewed and reviewed by the media. Fair?
Yes, and in not a positive light.
And not in a positive light. In fact, he was so aware it wasn't a positive light, he wanted to distance or protect this woman that he'd previously been flirting with and pursuing from that negative light. Is that fair?
Yes.
And he also, as you recall, had spent some effort on his phone trying to look up how to post things to the New York Times.
Yes.
And you're aware on that last page of that notebook, he even leads the reader, whoever that reader may be, to a Squarespace page. Fair? Did you know that at the bottom of that last page?
I don't remember that.
If that was there, would you agree that that's an indication that he's trying to direct someone to get to a web page?
Objection, speculation.
Doctor, you can't speculate, but if you can opine on this without speculating, you can answer the question.
I can infer, and I'm a little concerned that infer is too much speculation, so I'm not going to answer the question.
Very fair.
Okay. Thank you, Doctor.
Can I have a moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
Doctor, we had talked about his ability to act volitionally. Do you recall that? His ability to make choices?
Yes.
And in this particular case, he was aware that he was choosing improving how he valued himself over the lives of others, correct?
Yes.
He also could resist that belief, resist that, there's no irresistible impulse, I guess what I'm asking you. He could resist, he could make decisions, make choices, correct?
Correct.
And that in the weighing that he goes through, even in the state that you've described as impaired, it is clear that this was a selfish, self-centered decision to improve how he felt about himself over the lives of those he killed.
Objection, improper opinion testimony.
Overruled?
Go ahead, Doctor.
Well, I think it is, it's hard to argue that it's not a selfish decision. The only thing that I would say is I think it was a selfish decision that was tied into delusional psychotic thinking.
Understood. And that psychotic thinking was that he thought he could improve how he valued himself by killing people.
Correct.
May I have a moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
Nothing further, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right. Is there any redirect?
Yes, sir. Dr. Metzner, if Mr. Holmes had not been delusional, do you think he would have sent that Gmail chat to Gargi Dada about human capital?
No.
If Mr. Holmes had not been delusional, would he have bought tear gas?
In my opinion, no.
If he was not delusional, would he have bought handcuffs?
No.
If he was not delusional, would he have bought a bunch of armor, including a gas mask and helmet and ballistic gear?
No.
If he was not delusional, would he have bought guns and ammunition?
No.
If he was not delusional, would he have gone to the theater and checked out all of the theaters to see which would be the best one to complete his mission?
He would not.
Would he have bought road stars?
No.
Would he have put all of those black, explosive, incendiary type devices in his apartment?
No.
Would he have written the notebook?
No.
You stated that you relied a lot on the notebook. And since the notebook talks about hatred, why is it that you don't think hatred was a significant motivator in the shooting?
Well, for several reasons. The first one is the hatred, the feeling of hatred was not new. And so it goes back to, if he's had this for years, why is he now acting on this? And lots of us have not very nice thoughts at very different times. He had not very nice thoughts, meaning hatred and homicidal thinking for prolonged periods of time, but there's a big difference between having those thoughts and acting on those thoughts. And the question, again, why didn't he act on these thoughts before? And that's why I think that's not a major reason that he did what he did, because you have to look at what's changed, and what's changed is he's psychotic. And that's why.
Would you agree that that delusion that Mr. Holmes has is a distasteful delusion? Your Honor, he talks about noble delusions.
Overruled?
Yes.
So I think you testified before about this, but does someone pick whether they get a noble delusion to save the world or whether they get a distasteful delusion?
People don't have a choice in when they become delusional what their delusion's going to be.
You don't pick what kind of cancer you get. You don't pick what kind of delusions you get.
Sustained.
Doctor, can you liken it to getting inflicted with a particular kind of cancer and having no control over that, and getting a particular kind of delusion that you have no control over?
Yes.
Mr. Brockler asked you about things that maybe could be perceived as Mr. Holmes's consideration of some sort of escape plan. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Do you remember did Mr. Holmes in his notebook write that he figured there was a 99% chance of getting caught?
Yes.
So regardless of what purchases he made, it appears that Mr. Holmes knew he would get caught.
It's a follow-up question. I'll allow it. Overruled.
Correct.
Talked with Mr. Brockler about the sertraline. Could the sertraline have affected his symptoms in the months leading up to July 20th?
I've testified about what I thought the effects of the sertraline were. And so I would not say, I think if it had an effect, it was a limited, defined effect. So yes, and that happened in the months before. I don't think that effect happened over months.
Was there anything from Dr. Gurr's evaluation or Dr. Reed's evaluation that causes you to change your mind about the mitigation that you've found connected to Mr. Holmes' mental illness?
No, I thought that their testimony was consistent with what I'm saying.
Have there been any questions asked of you by Mr. Brockler that's caused you to change your opinion about any of the mitigation you testified to on direct?
No.
The long-standing homicidal thoughts and intense anxiety that you testified to, would you consider those prodromal symptoms of Mr. Holmes's mental illness?
Yes.
What does that mean?
That means before you have overt, obvious psychotic symptoms, you have other symptoms that are causing some impairments, but not so obvious as a psychotic symptom.
Mr. Brockler asked you about Mr. Holmes bringing up this idea of human capital after Gargi broke up with him. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Does that go to what you were describing earlier about perhaps the breakup being a stressor that triggered the psychosis?
It does. And I believe I had this in previous testimony, that the breakup with Gargi was a difficult breakup for him, and he wasn't feeling very good about it. And that's when he began exploring issues of self-worth. And I think that might have contributed to the flow of the particular kind of delusion that he developed.
Same question about, not doing so well in the lab, specifically with Professor Dell'Acqua. Could that have been a trigger to the psychosis?
As I've testified before, it could have been a trigger and it could have been unrelated, and I can't tell you which.
Mr. Brockler talked to you about choices that Mr. Holmes made. Were the choices that Mr. Holmes made on July 20th, 2012, all done under the cloud of his delusion?
Yes, and that's sort of the essence of my testimony today. The having psychosis doesn't take away your capacity to make choices. It may increase your capacity to make bad choices, and he clearly made some horrible choices. So it's not so much whether you can make a choice or not. And it really boils down to whether you believe that he had a delusion or not. And I think there's, for reasons I've given in previous testimony, that there's strong evidence to say that he had a delusion. And I think if you believe that he has a delusion, it's not hard to understand that his appreciation of his actions was pretty impaired. Now, if you don't believe that he had a delusion, then that's a whole different story.
And does that go back to the example you used before about someone may have Alzheimer's and they can still make choices, but it's whether they're good choices or not, and whether those choices were affected by the illness?
Correct.
And can that be said for Mr. Holmes, in your opinion, that the mental illness caused him to make these tragic choices on July 20th?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Brucker, do you have any recross?
I do, Your Honor. Thank you. Hey, Doctor, a couple things. You talked about sort of this consistency or consensus amongst the mental health providers. I want to ask you, you'd agree that even as far as the delusion goes, Dr. Reed is not wholly convinced as you are about this being the product of a delusion. Is that fair?
I think Dr. Reed was not as clear as I am. I don't believe that I ever heard Dr. Reed say that this wasn't a delusion.
You also would agree that he is not as convinced on the but-for and the importance of the but-for causation that you have described here. Fair?
Objection, it states the evidence and the speculation.
Overruled?
Go ahead.
Well, I thought that that question was asked to Dr. Reed on direct, and that he said, but for this one have happened. So that's my memory of Dr. Reed's testimony.
You don't recall. Yeah, that's what you think, but you're
Well,
not.
that's my memory.
You remember his report and everything he wrote in there, too, about it.
In his report, he was, I think, more ambivalent than he was in his testimony.
You also had indicated that, look, he clearly, the defendant had made bad choices, correct?
Correct.
But to be clear, he doesn't view them as bad choices, right?
Correct. I think that he did not view that as bad choices. He viewed that as the choice he was going to make.
And these were choices that were designed to fulfill a belief that he had that he could value himself more by taking human lives.
Would I object to belief as opposed to delusion?
Overruled?
Doctor?
Yes.
There was a discussion, too, about cancer and dementia and Alzheimer's and all this stuff. To be clear, he was aware that he had thoughts that were objectionable, correct?
Yes.
In fact, part of the way he knows that is because when he reaches out to Miss Dada, he is testing her, as you know, to see what she thinks about those thoughts, correct?
Yes.
And she soundly rejects them, right?
Well, I think she does a combination of two things. I think she, to the extent that she understands them, she rejects them, and then to the extent that she doesn't understand at the end, she just drops it, essentially.
In fact, she tells him, it sounds like what you're just talking about is just destruction, right?
I think she says something to that effect.
His awareness is such, though, that he does not share with Miss Roth, Drs. Fenton, or Drs. Feinstein those exact same thoughts and beliefs. Fair?
Objection beyond the scope of redirect.
Overruled?
Correct.
And he also knows, though, that they want to treat him with some drugs that may take those thoughts away, those antipsychotic drugs. Fair?
Well, he certainly knows that they want to treat him. I'm not sure that he knows, since they don't know, that that's the exact purpose of the drugs. But clearly he knows that they want to treat him with some antipsychotic meds.
And he rejects those offers.
Correct.
One of the things that you were asked was a series of questions by Miss Brady about, but for the delusion would this have happened? But for the delusion would this have happened? But I want to be clear about something you said on cross, and I think you testified to it earlier as well. And that is, he had the ability to resist his beliefs, correct? He had the ability to make choices to do something or not to do something, correct?
Yes.
And part of that is captured in the fact that even as he sits in his car with his body armor around him, road stars on the seat, 700 rounds of ammunition ready to go, he still calls the University of Colorado right?
Correct.
And that too is an awareness that he knows what he's about to do is wrong.
Objection, speculation?
Overruled.
Go ahead, sir.
As I've testified before, that certainly was evidence that he had the capacity to know the difference between right from wrong with respect to those acts.
And you would agree that in his conduct, as he told, I think you, but certainly Dr. Reed, he was acting on his own authority. Fair?
Yes.
And it was on his own authority that the decisions that he made leading up to the 20th, and including the 20th when he walked in that theater, were decisions to choose how he felt about himself over the lives of the people in that theater. Accurate?
Yes.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
All right. It looks like the jury may have at least a question, Doctor, so if you would give us a moment, please. Thank you. Thank you. Would counsel please approach? Dr. Metzner, the jury has submitted some questions that, based on the rules of evidence and other applicable rules of law, I have found are appropriate. So I'm going to ask those questions now. The first question is it common for people with schizoaffective disorder to have delusions of killing?
No, I don't think it's common. In medicine, we'll say it's not uncommon, but it's, most people with delusions don't have thoughts of killing. But what I will tell you, to give you some idea, is in this state and in most states, you have involuntary commitment laws, which means you can hospitalize someone against their will if they meet certain criteria. There's usually 3 criteria. One is that they're a danger to others. So that gets into whether people have thoughts of hurting others or not. The other one's danger to self, and the last one's gravely disabled. So my answer is it's not uncommon.
The next question is, if someone doesn't have control over what delusions they get, do they have control on whether they act under delusion?
The answer is it depends, and it depends on the nature of the delusion. It depends on the environment that the people are in, or the people providing external structure, and it depends on that particular person. So sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no.
The next question is there a difference between someone having to act or wanting to act under delusion?
That's a very tough question because it gets into what I was being asked about. Is this an irresistible impulse, or is it an impulse that you didn't resist? And there are, would you just say that?
Is there a difference between someone having to act or wanting to act under delusion?
Again, it's hard to answer because I think it depends on the nature of the delusion. And clearly not everyone who has delusions act on that delusion, and there are people who do act on the delusion.
The last question is, do you believe James Holmes had to act or wanted to act on his delusion? And you can only answer it if you know. You cannot speculate, or if you don't, if you're not able to provide an opinion about it, then you can't answer it.
I think I can't answer that.
Okay. Any follow-up questions based on those questions, Ms. Brady?
Just a couple. Doctor, there was a question about whether someone has to act on their delusion or whether they want to act on their delusion. And I think that your answer was it depends, and it depends on the nature of the delusion. Does it at all speak to the strength of the delusion if someone does act on it?
I think it does speak to the strength of the delusion if someone acts on it.
So to you, the fact that Mr. Holmes acted on his delusion, does that indicate to you that it must have been a strong delusion?
Yes.
There was a question that got to the essence of whether someone has the ability to resist the delusion. Does that also tie into the strength of the delusion?
I think whether you resist the delusion or not, you have to look at the totality of the circumstances. And the totality of the circumstances includes the nature of the delusion, but it also includes what else, the person's strengths, weaknesses, what's happening in his life, and whatever external structure he has or she doesn't have.
And does the ability to resist, is that too affected by the illness itself?
Yes is the answer.
Right, so someone who's mentally ill may have less ability to resist than someone who is psychologically healthy.
Well, if you have a delusion, you're not going to be psychologically healthy. You heard testimony before about if you had a delusional disorder in which your only symptom was a delusion and it's circumscribed, people are better able to isolate that particular delusion and keep it in check. Yeah, but if your delusion is part of another mental disorder that is not a delusional disorder, you're going to have other symptoms other than just a delusion, and those other symptoms are likely to make you less able to isolate that delusion.
So to be clear, you believe Mr. Holmes had more than just a delusional disorder,
Yes, I don't think there's any question about that.
because you believe he had schizoaffective disorder.
Correct.
Is that more serious than delusional disorder?
You don't want to have either one of those disorders. So I don't think, there's people with delusional disorders have a delusion that can cause problems. I don't think you can compare the two.
Okay. There's also a question about delusions that involve killing other people. Is it common for psychiatrists and psychologists to ask patients about what's called homicidal ideation?
Yes.
And why is that?
Well, because it's not uncommon for someone who's psychotic to have homicidal ideation, and even though, and so if someone has it, you want to be able to take steps to protect others and help that person get rid of it, or if you can't get rid of it, manage it.
And you were describing the law that enables you to take actions to make sure that no one gets hurt.
Correct.
Thank you.
Mr. Brockler, do you have any follow-up questions?
Your Honor, thank you. Doctor, to be clear, this delusion was not, whatever this belief, this delusion was not so strong that he had to act on it immediately upon having it. Fair?
Correct.
It did not deprive him of the ability to engage in months-long, detailed, specific planning. Fair?
Fair.
He didn't have to do it on July 19th. Correct? In fact, had something happened and the theater had been shut down for asbestos or the opening had been moved, he would not have just gone in and fired into an empty theater, right?
Objection, speculation?
Again, Doctor, the same instruction I've given you before. You can't speculate, but if you're comfortable opining on the question, then you can answer the question.
I don't know what he would have done.
Also, you'd agree that but for this specific criminal, murderous act, you find no evidence in the record of this delusion depriving him of the ability to conform his conduct to the rest of society's norms?
Object to the form of the question?
Overruled?
Correct.
In fact, this belief system that he has, this delusion that he has, wasn't so strong that he actually even wanted to get rid of it. Would you agree with that prior to July 20th?
I know that his homicidal thinking was distressing to him, and I think he wanted help with that. And I didn't ask him specifically enough in the context of your question about how much of the homicidal ideation that he wanted to get rid of was related to wanting to get rid of this thinking about human capital. So I don't know the answer to that.
Two things I want to ask you if you recall. Do you recall in the notebook that when he describes why he sought treatment from Roth, Fenton, and Feinstein, he indicates for anxiety and does not indicate anything about homicidal thoughts? Do you recall that?
Yes.
And you recall that after he's arrested, unmedicated, on the 24th of July, he tells Dr. Woodcock that his homicidal thoughts did not bother him. Do you recall that?
I think I recall that.
And frankly, whether it's not uncommon, which is a double negative, I imagine, for whether people have thoughts about killing people, one thing you'd agree with is for people that have a diagnosable mental disorder in that spectrum, they are far more likely to be victims than they are to be offenders. You'd agree with
Yes, yes.
that? Nothing further, Your Honor.
I'd object to that last question beyond this witness's expertise.
Overruled?
Go ahead. What was the answer, Doctor?
Yes.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
All right, may Dr. Metzner be released from his subpoena?
Yes, sir, thank you.
Any objection, Mr. Brockler?
No, sir. Thank you.
All right, Doctor, thank you.
Thank you.
Members of the jury, let me remind you again that the testimony of Dr. Metzner here in Phase 2 of the sentencing hearing was admitted by the court only for the limited purpose of proving the existence or absence of any mitigating factor. You shall not consider this evidence for any other purpose. All right, with that, let's go ahead and take our lunch break. It's 12:30, so we're a little bit late going into lunch, but we'll go ahead and take our usual time, and let's have you back then at 2 o'clock, okay? All right, enjoy your lunch. Make sure you follow all my advisements during the lunch break, please. Thank you. The record should reflect that the jury has exited the courtroom now. Everyone may be seated. With respect to juror 673 and the conversation I had with her earlier today and the defense's request to excuse her, I went back and looked at the admonishments that I have been giving the jury, and I confirmed that in general, the advisements that I have been giving them throughout the trial, I did not indicate that they were prohibited from learning information from news reports and the media related to any cases like this one. I said that they could not obtain information about this case from any news reports or media reports. Now, in the final jury instructions that I used at the end of the trial and at the end of phase one, I did include language to that effect that would prohibit learning information about a case like this one. But those instructions were for deliberations. They apply during deliberations only to the deliberating jurors. And juror 673 is not a deliberating juror. In fact, at the end of the trial, I gave the alternate jurors a different set of admonishments, separate and apart and different from the ones included in instruction number 1 in the final instructions that were for the deliberating jurors. And in the admonishments for the alternates, I did not make any mention of learning information from the media or any news reports about a case like this one. I did not give those separate advisements to the alternate jurors at the end of phase one before deliberations. But again, the admonishments that I gave in instruction number 1 of phase 1 of the jury instructions were directed at the deliberating jurors. And it's clear that they were directed at the deliberating jurors. So given all that, I again, on the record before me, can't find that juror number 673 has violated any of my admonishments. That was the basis for the request to excuse her. And I wanted to supplement the record because I went back and looked at those, at all the advisements I've been giving throughout the trial. And I don't have a basis to find that she has violated any of my admonishments in this trial. In any event, she's an alternate juror, so she hasn't been deliberating, and at least at this time, there are no plans to have her deliberate. But given that there's no basis to excuse her, we'll just keep her on as an alternate, and we'll proceed. Is there anything else at this time on behalf of the people before we take our lunch break? Mr. Brockler.
No, sir, thank you.
Is there anything else on behalf of the defense before our lunch break? Ms. Hicks?
Yes, Your Honor, just briefly, I would like to tender to both the district attorney as well as to the court very short video, family video clips. These are part of our 32.1 disclosures. We anticipate introducing those tomorrow. And so I'm going to give the people as well as the court copies of these to review should there be any objections prior to that testimony.
These are short family videos of your client, related to your client?
That's correct.
Have I seen these before? Did the parties submit these in connection with P109?
No, sir.
I reviewed some short clips in connection with that motion that were family videos.
Your Honor, the people did not include these in that motion.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, then in that case, please give them to my staff and I will review them. Thank you for letting me know in advance. How many of them are there?
Excuse me, sorry, that's my stomach growling. I believe there are 17, but they're all well under 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. All right, Mr. Bruckler, do you have anything?
To plant the seed, Your Honor, for where we may be on the instructions for the end of Phase 2.
I'm sorry, I didn't. Oh, you're trying to figure out where we are? I worked on them this weekend. I have a draft already completed, and I'm going to share those with the parties probably at some point today, and then we'll go from there. I'll give you a chance to review them. I don't know how much more evidence the defense has. Are you still thinking, or given that we lost some time on Friday, are you now thinking Wednesday?
Yes.
So it gives us until Wednesday, and I don't know whether the people will have any rebuttal evidence in Phase 2 or not. But if they don't, then it'll be on Wednesday. Are you planning to rest at this point on Wednesday at the end of the day or sometime earlier than that?
Your Honor, I'm not sure what time it will be, because we have to finish the witnesses that we have, and I've given those names to the prosecution, and then we also have to play those 8, I believe, videos that we took on Friday. Although they're short, it'll still take, I think we calculated 2 hours and 40 minutes to play those to the jury. So once we get all that done, I anticipate that we'll rest.
Plus, there's a 9th video recording, which we did earlier than last Friday. So there's a total of 9. And that first one, I think, was about an hour, maybe a little longer than an hour. So you got to add some time to that.
39 minutes, I'm being told.
Okay.
And to let the court know, we removed, and the court can tell us if it doesn't like this idea, but we removed the bench conferences where the static is playing. We just clipped those out. We can have the prosecution listen to it to make sure they're okay with that, but that noise on video is very loud.
I was really looking forward to hearing the static, just so that I could relate to what everyone goes through when I put that static on. So, no, obviously that's actually a great idea. So as long as there's no objection, I'm glad that you did that. All right, we'll be in recess. I'll see you after lunch. Thank you.